program. In particular, the Ash Center would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people, and a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. This event is being recorded, and the video will be publicly available on the Ash Center YouTube channel and through the website of the Harvard Project. You're welcome to submit questions anytime throughout today's program. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen instead of using the chat. And to start us off, I'll do a little table setting. I'll quickly go over some examples and resources around project selection and implementation. And then we'll hear from our guests who bring their experience in leadership, management, operations. And then we'll do a wrap-up, another wrap-up of ARPA updates with Jen Weddle and Del Labrador. Again, at any point, please feel free to send questions using the Q&A button. One of the major themes that we've discussed in the series around the American Rescue Plan is that it isn't just another grants program. You know, we're thinking about this almost in terms of the Marshall Plan, and it's really an opportunity for us to rebuild our nations. And tribal nations, like nations around the world, are grappling with the same kinds of issues. How do we build infrastructure? How do we provide safe water, clean roads, or safe roads, clean water, and essential utilities? How do we educate our people? How do we provide healthcare? What are important economic development projects that we need to support? How do we build jobs? And how do we build toward a future that can support and sustain our people? With that in mind, we'll start by looking at international development approaches to project selection and implementation, and then move into the private sector, and then we'll bring it home to Indian country. I'm going to throw a lot of information out to you all, but please know that the slides will be available after the session, so I don't feel you're missing out. And the slides also have hyperlinks to the resources that you'll see. So we'll start over here at the World Bank. You know, as I was saying, tribes are like nations around the world. And for the past 70 years, the World Bank has worked with governments around the world to end poverty and reduce inequality. And that experience has brought forth this 6-stage cycle, which helps them predict success and also helps them decide which projects are ready for investment. And at each stage, you'll see there's a bunch of checklist items, pieces that they want each of the project heads to be able to check off and say, yes, we've done this thinking here. And what are the important takeaways here? Well, first, it may seem obvious, but the most important thing is that there's a system. And I would bet that this isn't the World Bank's first project cycle. And in fact, this is an iterative process where they're always looking at ways that they can improve project successes and help governments actually achieve the goals that they're looking for. Note on stage 2, the preparation stage, there's a lot of time and energy spent here. They're really focused in on, you know, what can you do in the beginning parts of a project to help ensure success as you go through. Also note that in stage 6, there's an evaluation process. It's really important to allow for reflections on what went right and what can be improved. Shifting gears from sort of World Bank and really big picture stuff, we can look at the private sector. And when you're reading about best practices learned from business management, you can find resources all over the place, from newspaper articles to business school journals, to local colleges and universities in your area. Some you have to pay for, and some are shared widely. This one I like. It's a great example from the University of Minnesota Library's e-learning initiative. And as a leader, a program director, a manager, or general employee, using tools like online courses can help you build your skill set. Here you see a similar decision outline that we saw from the World Bank, but it teases out a little bit more about decision-making models, and it shows you 4 different decision-making models and the different situations in which those models are most effective. Again, nobody's going to be quizzed on any of these things. These are just approaches and ideas and resources that are available for folks. So don't feel like you need to write anything down right now. It's just to help guide the conversation for a little bit later. Here's another example from MIT's Business School journal, the Sloan Management Review. It's called the Mediating Assessments Protocol, or the MAP approach. MAP approach might be easier for everyone to remember. And it was created by an economist who's also a psychologist, also a Nobel Prize winning economist, and 2 professors of business strategy. And my simple interpretation of the MAP approach is to take your project, break it down into smaller attributes, and then find ways that you can provide scores to those attributes to allow your decisions to be made more thoughtfully. So instead of going on a gut instinct or just what your past experience would lead you to believe, think about what are the little bite-sized pieces that you can actually provide numeration to, a number to, and then how does that guide what you're thinking? And did it help illustrate some pieces of a puzzle that you weren't really sure of at the beginning of a project, but this helps outline it at the end. There's also some lessons from around Indian country. One of the most exciting parts about working for the Harvard Project is actually going through the Honoring Nations process. And every year we get to learn about all the different ways Indian country is solving problems and improving lives. And here are some topical examples that I thought might be of interest. Each of these green boxes hyperlinks to the tribe's specific programs. So at the end, you'll be able to download the slides and click on the links to the programs. But what are some of the traits that came out of these, whether it was education, healthcare, employee development, or infrastructure, or cultural resources? What were some of the things that we saw were commonalities? We saw, they were spent a lot of time on assessing where they were first. They understood exactly where they were. They helped build a shared vision of where they wanted to go. Whether the project came from employees or whether it came from leadership, there was a lot of energy spent around building this sort of shared vision. Then you guide decision-making with cultural values. Each step of the way, each one of these programs had culture bolstering it along the way and keeping it from the program either heading too far off the goals of the society. Each one of the programs invested in workforce development. They may have relied on outside people to come in and help out at some point, but what they wanted to do was build that internal capacity so that they themselves would be able to take over, manage, run, and help steer the projects into the next phase. And last but not least, they learned from all their mistakes and they build on those successes. So the Harvard Project sister organization, the Native Nations Institute, who I mentioned as a collaborator at the beginning of the show, has a number of great tools and resources that are available for folks to go and peruse. In particular, the Indigenous Governance Database. It's just a wealth of knowledge in here. There's pre-recorded presentations, video interviews, policy briefs, reports. You can get as folksy as one-on-one interviews with folks, and as nerdy as the in-depth policy briefs. This is a quick example, and the bullet points here are just a highlight. David Montgomery, who's the former budget officer from Quinault Indian Nation. the Quinault was just tired of going through strategic planning, identifying next steps, and then, you know, going back to the office and putting those great plans on a shelf only to get dusty. And you only undust them next year when you got to review them again. So instead, they built this fantastic roadmap that helps guide Quinault departments, and it helps show them this sort of shared vision and commonality. It's a really great interview, and yeah, hope you guys enjoy that one. One of the other resources that came out of a Harvard project and NNI collaboration is a strategic analysis for Native nations. Here, this is not a tool for you guys to take and say, oh, we can use this, but it's rather to show you, you know, the other slides gave you ideas about creating good environments, about encouraging participation, about some lessons learned. But here, you know, this is sort of a concrete kind of a tool. It's a matrix that you could build for yourself, something that helps you visualize and see the different components of your projects or of any strategic planning that you wanted to do. This one's around economic development, but you can envision something that's for a nation that would, you know, each of the sections would be geared toward a specific element, whether it be education or healthcare or whatnot. But it allows you to see sort of everything together in one place. The Harvard Project and NNI also have worked closely on a governance analysis tool. And this is sort of the beginning stages, you know, how do you assess where you are right now? And that's not the point of today's session and today's discussion. But at the end of the governance analysis session, there is an action planning process. And here, this is something that I think is applicable to folks who are looking at strategic decision-making and implementation. Identifying how to do an action plan. And again, you know, this is a simple worksheet, you know, nothing proprietary, you know, lay things out, make it clear, and make it available for others to review too. So I've thrown out a lot in a very short amount of time, and I hope I've greased the gears for the conversation coming up with our distinguished guests. Their firsthand experiences in making that important move from planning to selecting and implementing things, helping Native nations to make that next step is actually what we're all here for today. And so I'd like to introduce you all to Chairwoman Cheryl Andrews Maltese from the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead at Aquinnah, which is located off the coast of Massachusetts on Martha's Vineyard. Chairwoman Andrew Maltese is in her third term as chairwoman and also serves on the USET Board of Directors. Previously, she served in the Obama administration as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs. We also have Patricia Riggs, who is Tigua from Isleta del Sur, which is headquartered in El Paso, Texas. Pat is currently an Indigenous consultant, and with over 20 years experience in project development, economic development, strategic planning, you name it. Pat has worked tirelessly for her nation as well as others in the areas of strategic development. And Joan Tamici, who is Hopi from the village of Old Arribe in Arizona. She's the executive director of the Native Nations Institute for Leadership Management and Policy at the University of Arizona. She's also on the board of directors for the National Center on American Indian Economic Development and the Economic Development Authority for the Tana O'odham Nation in Arizona. Throughout her career, she's focused on strategic economic development, training, and outreach. Thank you, Chairwoman, Pat, and Joan for joining us today. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to sit with us and share your experiences. And Chairwoman, if I may start with you, as elected leader of your nation, you carry a very heavy basket. ARPA, again, is more than just a grants program, and the heavy investment dollars can bring about significant impacts in Indian country. What are the long-term decisions that you face as you think about ARPA monies and how it can help Aquinnah achieve its priorities in the long term?
Thank you. I just thank you very much for having me here today. And, it's been quite an extraordinary journey to get here underneath the COVID-19 pandemic, CARES Act, and now with the ARPA funds. And we're really excited because underneath the ARPA funding, which is significantly more funding than tribes have ever received in the past, our tribe in particular. Part of the consultation that we went through was trying to ensure that all tribes were able to benefit from this funding because over the centuries and specifically over the past several decades, a lot of tribes have not been able to receive funding, or at least enough funding to make any sort of real significant investments into their governmental structure, infrastructure, and or economic development. So what's been really challenging is that a lot of times these grant-driven allocations, they disproportionately set the smaller tribes or tribes that do not have as much human resource infrastructure within at a distinct disadvantage. Plus, because the funding is typically a lot less, there's no real continuity to it, and or not enough to really get something going for it so that it's sustainable. So underneath these ARPA funds, this is the first time our tribe is actually going to receive enough funding to at least begin something that we know whether we leverage the money or whether we utilize that money, and how we can really look at it from a strategic standpoint to see how we invest that money in our community, both our infrastructure as well as our programs and services direct to our tribal membership, as well as indirectly to build to have the stepping stones to be able to build our economy and our self-sufficiency as the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act intended. And that is all leading to, the tribe's ability to really exercise sovereignty. And that's what we're talking about here. Without our real estate or without our tribal lands or our trust lands or reservation lands, we have no foundation upon which to build. And then from getting our lands to be able to have the financial resources as promised from the United States government in trust and treaty obligations to financially support the initiatives of tribes. And moving on from there to actually be able to develop and build and see it through so that we have viable, sustainable economies for our communities, clean sanitary housing where our communities can rebuild, recapture a lot of the culture that was lost, prohibited by law, particularly for our people in the East and throughout the country. And this is the first time that we've actually been able to feel like we're actually getting a foothold in the ability to step up our game to get into there. We've had projects for years that we've identified as part of our strategic planning, land use planning, strategic planning. Every few years we go through it. And like you said in your introductory remarks, we all have these plans. We've gone through it year after year after year. But tribes, unlike other municipalities or states or local governments, don't have a tax base. So therefore, we necessarily don't have a lot of plans sitting on the shelves, shovel ready, because we need funding in order to do the feasibility studies, in order to get those plans underway. And then nobody has that money because we just can't, take from programs and services in the hopes that we get some funds in order to see these projects through. So by having some of those things that are sitting on the shelves for plans and this money coming through, we're eager to be starting our pathway towards building that infrastructure and setting our community into a position that we can actually reach more of our tribal community members. As you mentioned, we're on an island off the coast of Massachusetts, Martha's Vineyard. Everybody thinks we're rich, which we are not. We're not. We're the other side that changes the numbers from the average. Additionally, the challenge that we have is that we only have 25% of our tribal population that lives on the island, and even less of a percentage that lives up where our tribal offices are in our homelands. So it's always a delicate balance to be able to include our entire membership in the programs and services when we can only reach so far. So for us to be able to level that playing field and provide more services, direct and indirect, to as many tribal members as possible, we've pushed the envelope in expanding our right and responsibility to our tribal community through our sovereignty and as a self-governance tribe since the early 2000 and 2001 We feel that we're able to utilize that sovereignty and exercise that and make determinations and decisions which are in the best interest of our tribal community. I don't know, I don't want to take up too much time. I didn't know whether or not you want to go through the whole introduction of everybody.
That fits in really great with, I think, Pat. And if Pat, if you want to go next, you're a consultant now, but back in the early 2000s, you spearheaded a major initiative with Isleta del Sur Pueblo called Project Pueblo. And just as Chairwoman was just saying, about gathering data, understanding what's happening, you did that. You took that transformative time and you spent a lot of time and energy gathering information, creating surveys, reaching out to all the constituents. Can you tell us how some of those, what were those concrete steps? What did you undertake, and how did you get to the point where you knew that that's what you needed to do? Oh, you have to unmute, Pat. Oh, one more time.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Well, really it all started because we were in an economic crisis, right? Our casino had closed, the state of Texas. Really, we go back and forth. We've been going back and forth with the lawsuit from them for, well over 20 years. But basically, we needed to initiate new economic development programs, but we also needed to know what state we were in, what condition we were in. When our Speaking Rock first closed, we went from like maybe 3% unemployment to about 28%, basically overnight. But everything that we were considering as far as what our economic state was really a guesstimate. We didn't really have true information available to us. The information that or data that most tribes rely on is coming from other entities, right? It's either coming maybe for the Census Department, and for a while the BIA was doing that one survey on tribal economies that in the end didn't really pan out for us and a lot of other tribes. So we had to, in order even to get grants, we had to challenge that data because they were looking at our socioeconomic condition from census, and that wasn't the case anymore. And so we just kind of started as a grassroots efforts, and even as Chairwoman Andrews was talking about, you just don't have the resources, right? Where do you start? So I ended up getting an A&A grant to prepare a socioeconomic profile, but we didn't even have all the data to write the grant, right? So we just started grassroots, and I don't think it's not as hard starting as everyone would think it is. You just have to have a lot of determination and have some collaboration with the other departments, for example, census and economic development, as well as get the buy-in from tribal council, because when you first start, you're asking a lot of information from people, and so there's some concerns about privacy, about whether even people want to participate. And we actually had a really good turnout, but there was no way for us to know exactly what poverty levels we were at. Even things like unemployment, whether, how many children were living in poverty, just basic information that other communities are basically taking for granted. So one of the things that helped me is, of course, I brought the resources in to get it done. But as soon as we started, just even small snippets of information being reported out to tribal council, like, for example, we had a blood quantum citizenship, and when we reported that we're no longer enrolling tribal members because they didn't meet blood quantum. So eventually that was going to impact our community severely. So then we were able to get a lot more buy-in. But we did things such as we started with a questionnaire of socioeconomic indicators, but we also did things like focus groups, charrettes, and surveys, and then also just meeting with people and just kind of different departments and kind of having discussions about what problems that we're having as far as not having certain data to plan their programs correctly, right? I think the other thing is, one of the things that we did is even look back at past data that nobody was even really looking at. For example, we had to do some research to find out really what had happened over time, and being able to demonstrate that we had already had successes that we weren't really thinking about. Like, for example, in the 1960s, poverty was, just off the charts, 5% employment, fifth grade education, and just looking at maybe past reports or past newspaper articles and being able to graph that over time, just really demonstrated the tremendous efforts that our tribe had made to advance without even looking at data, and so that helped to move the other data forward as well. So eventually the data became a lot more sophisticated and a lot more a lot more sophisticated and a lot more scientific than when we started this project. But it was absolutely important to be able to move certain things forward. I would say, I guess the biggest area where we had, where I still have concerns with, not just within our tribe, but within programs across the nation and also tribal nations, is that we're not really looking at data in terms of measuring outcomes and impacts, right? Like we have these matrices, but they kind of end at who's responsible, activities, and what kinds of things you're doing. But haven't gotten to the point where we're saying that these programs or your tribe or your nation is better off because of what you're doing. And that's kind of the area that I think that everyone needs to work on more, because even though you have all this socioeconomic quantifying data, if you're not really looking at what you're doing is impacting your community in a good way, then you really haven't got to where you need to be. And then those are also issues of accountability and trust and areas such as that. But I mean, basic bottom line is, it was a grassroots effort. We knew we needed it and we just went for it.
Yeah. But your last point, I think, leads into Joan really nicely. Joan, through the work of the Native Nations Institute, has been all over Indian country and beyond even. I mean, we're talking about our First Nations relatives up north. We're talking about internationally as well, beyond our continent of Turtle Island. Joan, when you see, when Pat's talking about, these celebrating of successes, but also understanding impacts as they're happening within the community, the sharing of that information, how do you see that in your experiences across the different places that you've been? Because Indian country looks different. Big tribes, small tribes, coastal tribes, inland tribes. What do you see out there as some commonalities?
Okay. First of all, it's Asquali Masoso Yamiatzavalti. Thank you everyone for joining us here today. And thank you for this opportunity to join the panel. I have been blessed to be able to be working with Indigenous peoples worldwide. And, we're all wrestling with the same kinds of challenges. First of all, it's the protecting our sovereign status as a Native nation. That is always at the forefront. Oftentimes people at the lower levels that are not in government, they forget about that they wouldn't be able to have this kind of services that are available to them without the status of a Native nation. So sometimes that gets in the way when it comes to government versus individual needs, we have seen happening already with some of the prior money. And then the other thing that that we also wrestle with, no matter the size, is making sure that we have enough money to keep the governmental operations available. Chairwoman Andrews Maltese already talked about the fact that we don't have a tax base. So now we have to depend on grant revenues, we have to depend on indirect costs, we have to depend on business proceeds, the profits that come off of that, windfall settlements, whatever it might be. And that just keeps the government operating, and the socioeconomic challenges. And this is where it really tugs on elected leaders. We've seen this all over because everybody has needs at some level. Some people aren't able to pay their gas, and when the weather's cold, you have to wonder, well, what can we do to help our citizens? And so sometimes the priorities get all mixed up, they get all muddled up, and it's really hard to figure out, where best should we put our time and our energy. So I've seen this across the Native nations, and a lot of times we often are just responsive, and we do the best we can. I've seen that happen all over. And but I also have seen Native nations who've really just, sat down and said, we just can't keep being reactive. We have to figure out where are we going? What is it that is priority? And I think these new ARPA funds have given us that opportunity to do so, to really think through, now is the time for us to really figure out what is our priority as a tribe. Is it the protection of us as a sovereign nation? Is it getting back more of our land above all things? What is it? Making sure we have enough money to operate, as a government, before we begin to address all of these little things. I think the last time we were faced with that for many of the tribes who went in the gaming route, they, when they had funds, they had to go through, their plan. The same kind of things have to happen here. And I think what I've seen those nations do is, those that have been able to wrestle with it, is to really sit back and think through, just like Pat was explaining, and some of the work that Isleta del Sur did, is taking a look at what are our priorities? What do we envision for ourselves? And a long time ago, when you think about it, our culture or religion, I call it religion for those of us who are still able to have our cycles and practices in place, that used to give us that guidepost down the road, because we all knew what we were headed towards. Everybody was in agreement. And yes, there might be some folks out there who may not have totally agreed on the direction or the approach, but basically we all knew where we were headed. And I think it's just those tribes are trying to go back to that and trying to figure out, where do we want to be down the road, whether it's 50 years. And we always raise the question in terms of your children, 50 years from now, what do you want, kind of a community do you want for your children or your grandchildren or your great grandchildren? What do you want to keep and, preserve for them that you experienced? What do you want to see different? And just visioning that. And we saw that with Connaught when they went out. And they asked the young, not elementary kids, they asked them, and they drew pictures of what community looked like for them. And, that's, to me, those are guideposts that we can work towards. And I think it's up to administration and communities to decide, how do we get there?
And sometimes we do have to resort to these Western modes of these matrices, that you saw that NNI does, the GAN, the governance analysis that we do. But, when you think about it, we're really, we can do this anytime, any place, because think about ceremony, what goes into ceremony, right? We're already pre-planning that, sometimes, multi-years in advance of it, like in Hopi, a wedding. Oh my God, a wedding takes many, many years because we have to have so much corn, blue corn and white corn to be able to make that, to make the payments that we have to do to grind the corn. Everything has, everything is being planned, and there are roles and responsibilities. So this is not new to us. And, we've held ourselves accountable. We're in a different world today, and sometimes we forget to rely upon things, that we've known to us and that are just common and everyday to us. And so I don't know if I really got to your question, to your answers, but I think that Native nations who are really trying to figure out that balance today of how much of that do we do, how do we move forward? And no matter, their size, what kind of assets they may or may not have, everybody can take stock of where it is that they want to be headed. What do they have right now? What's lacking? How do we overcome these things? And what are the roles that we're going to be moving forward? So anyway, I think I'll just stop at that, and so we can allow more conversation.
Well, Joan, I think that tees up a great question for Chairwoman Andrew Maltese about sort of leadership's role. Pat's talking about how she's building energy on the employee side and educating tribal council. But as a elected leader, what are some strategies? What are some sort of concrete things that you think are important for tribal councils to then either engage with the departments or engage in with the community? What are some things that you think are helpful?
Well, I think it's all of the above. I mean, initially, when we're running, which we're always running, it seems, no matter what time or what, and I'm actually in my 4th term, so I've done this quite enough.
4th term, yes.
Yeah. But the thing is that we're always talking with people. So whether you're running this year or you're calling on behalf of another council member that's running, you're always engaged with your community. So that this way you're getting the full broad spectrum, or at least you hope you are, because you're contacting everybody. What is it that you'd like to see? How do you think we're doing? Are these the types of priorities that you want us to continue with? When we bring it to the community to take a vote, that's our marching orders. And then from there, we have a department, and I call them my subject matter experts, because, I can talk on a surface level, but when it gets right down to boots on the ground and rolling up their sleeves and doing it, my subject matter experts have to figure out what the mechanisms are in that black box. So my community is the raw materials. We know what we want to do because we've all identified that. Leadership is charged with executing it, and our subject matter experts are in charge of creating that box or that machine that makes all those things come together and, at the end of the day, have the desired goals. One of the challenges that we have is that not everybody in the community is outspoken and vocal. So therefore, oftentimes you have a more vocal minority speaking of specific interests versus what the more silent majority is. And in leadership, we're constantly in that balancing act, to be able to sit there and say, okay, we're making a decision based upon everything and all the information that we have at hand, because oftentimes not everybody's heard the same information. So we have to use that as a deliberative process. I really love what Quinault did to sit there and take the elementary school or the children to envision what their future should be and use that as a guidepost to lead us there. Because once we get to a certain point, we've already ingrained some sort of ideal or idea in our heads, and it's very hard to dislodge that process. So by having the kids who are going, this is what we're working for. We were blessed by our ancestors and our elders to be here where we're at today. And we're doing all this work for the benefit of our children, grandchildren, and the next generations to come. So that would be a great place to be able to identify that and working towards those goals. And I think that when we're talking about like with the international indigenous peoples or the United States providing financial support, as sovereigns here owed this financial support, we don't get treated the same way as when the United States gives funds internationally. Their measure is, how is that culture, how is that community, how is that country doing? Are they better off? They don't report in quarterly. They don't do all of this other minutia type of reporting that tribes are required to in a parochial sense. And so there's just this disparity that, if we were, I always say, just write the check. We've been doing this, as Patricia and as Joan had said, we've been doing this since time immemorial. This is not new. This is a newfangled process that the government's having us do now. We didn't have constitutions. We didn't have time limits on things. We didn't leave until everybody was in consensus, so everybody's either as happy or as mad, but at the end of the day, everybody could agree upon the next step and where we're going. This situation or this newfangled government or modern government that we're required to follow, this constitutional government that we're required to follow, is in itself counterculture. So it makes it even more difficult for us to be able to get to where we need to be, because again, we want to be able to provide those direct services and that support, but is that to the expense and detriment of building the capacity to do it better? We have a step here. How do we create these wraparound services for our entire community and change the paradigm and the perception of what the tribal government's supposed to be like, and bring it back to what we are supposed to be like, which is taking care of our entire community, no matter what their needs are. And if you don't need, you don't take, but if you need, we're there to support, and building it so that we're supposed to be lifting each other up, and you get higher up because I'm there to lift you up, not what's been happening the other way. So, and I probably went off on a tangent.
No, because I think you go right into when I think about ARPA and all the planning that needs to get done. This community engagement piece is really important and complicated, because it in itself can just take over, just like the planning stage can take over. The community engagement can take over, and then you just end up with these standing meetings the whole time.
And part of the real, I guess, challenge as leadership is, at what point are we compelled to say, this is all we can do for direct support? Because, and what we're looking at, or what we're hoping to do, is look at, all of the money, once we know what all the money is going to be, what the guidelines, parameters, prohibitions are. And then we can say, okay, out of this chunk of money, these are our major priorities. What percentage do you want to put into that bucket? And then start working backwards from our end, start with the end in mind kind of thing. But, how do we allocate out those funds, and then have the strength and the inner fortitude to stick by that conviction? Because if we don't, then we're going to be right back at square one again. And it's really hard, because unlike other politicians, we're related to everybody, everybody in the community. So no matter if you're at the supermarket, or if you're for us on the ferry, or, even at home, happy 4th of July. Oh, thank you. That's so kind of you to call while I got you on the phone. Really? But again, are you not going to take the call? Are you not going to engage? Of course you are. Right. So it's a really hard, position that we step up as tribal council and leadership. And then whenever we can, it's like, well, subject matter experts, is this something that we can actually do? Or is it something that we have to wait and say, okay, we got to grow to that capacity. We've got to get there, because we're just not here yet. No matter what we do, we still need a few more steps to get to that next level. And that's why, the nation building and the Native Nations building and everything that Patricia and Joan are doing is so critically important, by having that structure that I would say the outside world understands, speaking their language, but it's transferable for us to be able to gather that information from our communities individually and unique as each tribal nation's community is, to be able to take that and then kind of stuff it into what they need to hear. And then that way we can move to the next steps. But it's like Patricia said, you just have to have the will to do it and willing participants to want to roll up their sleeves and do that. And you know, it means a lot of times restructuring how your councils began, because IRA tribes, you know, constitutional tribes, all of the rest of the structure that we were required to adopt is not how we function, and certainly not how we function at optimal way of functioning for our community.
Yeah, and Pat, one of my favorite words that you use is tiguifying. How you have taken processes, you have taken, and you know, and that's to say you've learned from others, right? This is not just you doing everything by yourself, right? This is a bigger piece of the education process, sort of reaching out. What else is there in Indian country? What else is there outside of Indian country? And how do you tiguify it? How do you make this applicable to Isleta del Sur in a way that's meaningful, and just like Chairwoman is saying, you know, matters to the people? How did you do that?
Well, I think, yeah, well, first of all, everything that we did, you know, back in 2007, 2010, it seems like eons ago, but I think we can still see the impact of it, and just how everyone is, I mean, you got to give credit to everybody, right? Within the tribe, everybody has something to contribute, whether it be a department or whether it be your citizens. And so is this a question about community engagement, or?
Yeah, it can be about community engagement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just really feel that, well, one, within your own community, you're giving people a voice, right? That's what like community engagement is all about, and also removing those barriers. And as well, Joan was talking about our ceremonies and how there was a complete realm of planning to make sure that take place, and it also cooperation from everybody, right? So I really think that much in the same manner, we're engaging our citizens and thinking about what specific impacts certain programs are having on them. And so to get everybody, I think to build trust, you need to look at community engagement in terms of your community, right? Like, what are you gathering from elders? If you're doing strategic planning, you cannot do strategic planning in a manner that takes you away from your culture. You have to do it in a manner that brings you back to your culture, and that helps. One of the reasons you're building programs or building businesses is to bring those resources, and to get those resources to be able to plan your community and live your tribal lives the way even not just you are envisioning, but your ancestors envisioned, right? And also the way that your offspring want to envision it. So I just think it's very important to make sure that, you know, that is brought in. And then the other thing I think is that, there's so many different levels of community engagement, and you want to ultimately get to the highest engagement that you can. But I mean, first you start in forming, and if your citizens aren't educated about certain concerns or issues, they're not going to trust what you're doing. You have to educate them, and then you gather engagement from focus groups or from just meetings, having conversations, questionnaires, whatever it is. But then you also need to engage them in building things. Like, for example, if in a social services program, right? If you're building a program from information coming from people that have good jobs and within your community and that have health insurance, and because they're in leadership or they're in positions of authority, you're making assumptions about what your community needs, because it's the people that actually need those services that know. So so to take it to the next level, also you have to engage people in decision making as well. Like, are they helping you create policy? Are you talking to your elders to make sure you're not getting away from certain core values and things that they had envisioned for their grandchildren? Are you putting your tribal citizenship in boards and committees? And so are they helping to support, building a better nation?
When I think about all you just said, Pat, it reminds me of all the conversations that we've all had with Joan, because she's always like this truth teller for us, right? She's always sharing ways that she's seen communities either struggle or get stuck, but then how they sort of move out of them. And Joan, I think your experience with helping tribes looking at strategic planning in general, but then moving beyond those plans and always saying, I'm not the one that can be the driver of this. It has to be you. What kinds of tools, or what kinds of even things that you would, warn people against as they're looking at implementing these plans, establishing the budgets for these new programs? From your experience, what would you say is a best practice there?
Before I get to that, let me just make one comment that I've been itching to say something about. Chairwoman was talking about, the role of the government, and how you're often sticking to the priorities and the challenge that you face in regards to that. And one of the things that when we work in community, that also gets raised too, because sometimes we're working with communities where the term's only 1 year or 2 years, and they say, well, this is all well and good for this council's term, but next year we're going to have a new council coming in, and how do we guarantee that they're going to support what it is, our voice that we're now putting forward? And I and our team firmly believe that if community is on the same page in terms of the priorities that they want to move towards, and these can be things like great visionary things, and as the chairwoman laid out, then you go to your, you get the endorsement of the council to say that this is our strategic plan, we have adopted it by the council. So it holds, a formal status down to the staffers, the expert matters at helping to develop the strategies. And then that way you can just, you're holding it's the people that can make sure that the leaders that they put in place, the elected leaders, because they're going to be the ones to make this happen over the years, are going to help them in proceeding in that strategic plan. A lot of these goals cannot be done overnight. They take years to get to that state, whatever that key performance indicator, that way that you want to be able to see people living a healthy life, whatever, people have to define that. So you have to have some kind of indicators in that. So you look to electing or appointing, whatever the case may be in your community, usually they're electing leaders who are going to help you accomplish that. And it's to hold everybody accountable to say, we all agreed to these priorities. And yes, they're not set in concrete, we can change them. But overall, these are the big picture goals that we would like to be able to achieve down the road. And how we get there from year to year, our change can be changed and they can be addressed. But back to the tools and things that maybe that I would encourage people to be on the lookout for are to, if you can solidify the strategic plan, as I mentioned, I think I've seen a couple of nations. I know years ago, I did some work with the Yavapai Apache Nation. And one of the cool things that they did is once they came up with their priorities, it went back to the council and they adopted it by resolution. Then, folks like Isleta del Sur, there's a number of them who then have taken those strategic plans and then matched them up to their budgeting process, because you still need the resources to be able to get there. And yes, we are never going to have enough money to be able to accomplish everything that we would like to be able to get to. But once we set these goals and then the objectives in motion, that at least gets us forward. So you do need to have a plan in place of just priorities. I always look to top 5 and make them big goals. And then you can get to the objectives that can be done in shorter terms, in 1 year term, if that's what it's going to take for the political people, or even for community, because community has to see growth occurring within that. They have to be able to see that change is happening. And if they can identify and others can help to identify what that change is, then people can see that we are making progress. We're making baby steps, but every baby step's going to add up to a lot down at the end of the road. And then the other thing that has to be done is communicating with your constituents, with all of the community, making sure that once you've gathered all of the factions within the groups, within your community, because you have to go out and get all of the factions out there, all of the target populations. I always say, take time to identify those naysayers and spend some time with them. Try to get them to become allies, maybe the cheerleaders, and take on the roles so that they can help to resolve this, because they too have ideas about how to address these things. And so, you just never know what's out there. But it's then always communicating with community about, here's the progress that we've made. This was a goal of ours 5 years ago, to have our own hospital, in our community. And year 1, we got the land, we did all of the land, got the land approvals and all the assessments and everything. Year 2, here's what we did, so that people can see the movement being made forward, step by step, going down the road. But if you don't communicate, then of course, you just have the rumor mill occurring.
That transparency really is key.
Yes.
Not only to holding you accountable for the actions that you said that you'd commit to, right? Yes. But then also for people to see the accomplishments and actually celebrate those successes.
Yes. And that's the last thing too, is celebrating them, because we don't do that. We're really good at saying what didn't happen. But we don't do enough about what we did accomplish. Right. And we have to believe in ourselves. We're sometimes our own worst enemy within our own communities, because we know everybody, we grew up with them, we know what happened years ago, and we forget that they change, and all of those things. So it's a belief in ourselves as individuals and as a people, because we just, otherwise we're not gonna get very far.
Yeah. There was a really great question that came through the Q&A that I'd like to pose to all 3 of you. And so pipe in as you want to. The Elizabeth Horseman says, if there's time, can the panelists please address strategies to identify, engage, and educate tribal youth as future tribal leaders within strategic planning or plans? Joan, I know you've seen it, so you can definitely go to it. But Cheryl, you were about to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say, one of the things that we what I would personally like to see, and discussed it, nationally with, youth groups that I've been involved in, is it is so important to engage our youth, but there's so much institutional knowledge that comes with leadership to be making those decisions, and to ensure that there's, a full, I guess, representation of young people, fresh perspectives, new ideas in this new, time, but also evaluating the information and the knowledge, the institutional knowledge of people that have been there, and creating an emeritus type of situation that, so that there's transition. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in Indian country leadership is that, unlike traditional way of formal government and leadership, this election cycles, and a lot of times they're more power struggles, and it's not about power. Everybody wants to do the right thing by the community, by the people, but there's just so much that goes into that I think that, trying to instill that it's a transition by learning on the ropes, by engaging the young people, getting them involved and engaged in government, in governance, getting them involved and engaged in the practical aspects of the administration of that government, and teaching them, because not for now, I've been doing this for, whoops, my daughter just made me pay her. But I've been doing this for a very long time, and I'm third generation. So I sat there in front of Congress just the last times we were there saying, I cannot believe I'm having the same exact conversation again, almost 20 years later, that my mother had 30 years ago, that I sat as, a young person, that my grandmother was having at the council meetings. I don't want my daughter to be having the same conversation. So it is an evolution, but there's just so much history and legacy. And I don't know, Patricia or Joan, whether it's which one or both, had gone back to say all that other information that we have. It's our current history, but that's really important to know where we've been, how we've come, and keep hitting those benchmarks and demonstrate that progress that we've had and we've been making. But we need to get our young people engaged, but they also need to know where we were to where we are now and where we need to go. Hope that helped.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
if I
oh, go ahead, Joan.
Yeah, I was just going to pipe in here. Well, some ways that I have seen across the U.S. Have been tribes have created small groups, and they do them all over. It can be through a YMCA, it can be through a youth group that's attached to maybe a substance abuse program. It can be a youth employment program. It could be more formal, like a youth council. And these bodies, it's just a matter of getting groups of folks together. It can be done in the high schools, even at getting them to think about their own future and begin to talk to them about what do they see for the nation. A lot of times we've had youth governance camps before. We'll do drop-ins at youth councils to do training about what governments do and the role of citizens. And so I think that there's just a whole lot more opportunities out there. There's that people can begin to address, but it's a lot of self-education. I always tell tribes when they're moving down this route that they find a way to get the students involved. And one of the simple ways to do that is to get them to go out and do interviews of former leaders. They all have their phones. And great, they're always on Instagram and Twitter and everything else. So it's a great opportunity for them to be able to have questions, and even particularly if they've been a former elected leader, to ask them about maybe the challenges or what it takes to be a leader, what was their biggest success. It's even asking all of our grandparents those same kind of questions. What was it like growing up here? Documenting things like that can be put hopefully in a great repository that some young student will come in and clean them all up for you, and you can post them up on the website. We need to just engage them. We need to get them interested in and understanding that the decisions that get made today are going to impact them, when they become the adults. Pat, I don't know if you recall the one time that we did the training for the Isleta del Sur youth, the first training that we did for the youth council. I can recall that the lieutenant governor came in as doing the welcome speech, and he said, I hope that you'll take advantage and listen to everything that's being said, because you're going to be making decisions for me when I'm a senior. You're going to be determining if I'm going to live the rest of my life here on the reservation, or if you're going to send me off into El Paso to some center. These are the kinds of decisions that you guys have to make. And I'm looking to you to learn about these things. And a lot of times, you know, we as kids, we don't know that that's what our role is. We don't think about those kinds of things. We're involved in all kinds of stuff. We want to be in love and whatever, you know, get away, get out of the house or whatever it might be. And so I think that we just need to find those mechanisms where, and you can best, you know, in your own communities, you're probably have the best gauge of how you might best be able to approach it. But anyway, those are just some quick ideas off the top of my head. And definitely include them in your strategic planning process. Always include a contingency, even if it's representative of some of the schools. We've done that in some of the communities that we worked with, where they sent, you know, 6 or 10 kids from the high school to participate in the planning session, because it's educational to them too as well.
Right, Joan. Yes, I remember when you came for the first time and we did that youth governance camp. And one of the things that we learned from that is that some of our youth really had very little knowledge on tribal history and the way the government worked. And so we ended up building a youth nation building summer camp where we taught them different things about civics and things about just basic Indian country policies, sort of broader things that they need to learn as becoming tribal leaders, things about culture. We engaged them with, had them input like what they want to vision for the future. We also had
Oh no, Pat was saying that they have thunderstorms going over El Paso, and she was hoping that her video wouldn't freeze.
Well, as both Patricia and Joan were saying, like having the youth councils and party unity and getting our young people out and engaged, you know, COVID really just threw a monkey wrench into everything I think for all communities, especially, you know, engaging their young people. And hopefully, as this year in the petri dish that is our homelands, we get through it and our young people can get back engaged and back involved, and we start doing more of that. Because, you know, for us, particularly in the Northeast, there's not a whole heck of a lot of exposure. We are surrounded by non-Indians. You know, you can't sneeze without hitting somebody, you know. So, but by being able to send our young people either to our United South and Eastern Tribes, you know, youth groups, to Unity, you know, to NCAI's youth groups, and all the other opportunities that they have. We used to have wonderful powwow season in Skimitzin, and our young people would go picking up on that culture, engaging with our elders. But it's a balancing act, because they don't want to take away from academics, you know. However, they need to know that culture, and they need to understand, I guess, the soul of who we are, you know, and why we're still here, you know, despite centuries, you know, 3 centuries, almost 4 centuries of attempted genocide. We're still here, and we will remain. But they need to understand that, as well as live in this contemporary world and navigate and function through a government that is not set up to be what it promised. But you need to know what it is and navigate. So all of those young government types of programs that they have for young people, and also just for them to be able to engage and meet each other. Because again, we sit across the table from friends that I've had since I was a girl. I mean, literally a tiny tot dancing at powwow. And it doesn't matter whether we agree or disagree on any point. and we're from different tribes, but we've known each other. We've known each other all our lives. We know each other's heart. We know where we're coming from. We're just disagreeing on the path, as I think you mentioned earlier, Amy. But we all know this is where we're at. This is where we want to be as, tribal people, as our native nations. But how do we get there? Well, they may want to go this way, and we could sit there and then ultimately as tribal leaders, we said, well, that's all right, because I'm just going to tell your mother anyway, and it doesn't matter how old we are, we're still telling each other's mothers if they're still with us on each other, only because that's the only way to get them to act right. So I mean, there are certain things that never change, whether you're a young person or, a young adult or an older adult or an elder. We're all still the same people that we know. And when you know them nationally or locally, you really have a better chance at success. And also, whether it's Joan or Patricia that said, sharing that information from tribe to tribe and nation to nation, it's best practices. What will work for me will not or may not work for somebody else. And our unique situation often can work just about anywhere. But we also know that everybody has to do it because it's not cookie cutter and one size does not fit all.
Back.
Yay! Sorry, Pat, you were saying about youth leadership and youth engagement. Do you want to finish your thoughts about including youth and I sort of see it as really, if you're building the shared, Chairwoman was just talking about building a shared vision. And it's hard to do that if your youth don't know where you want to go.
Right. Well, I think I was talking about giving credit to other YDSP agencies who are also supporting youth. And one of the things that they're doing is, like, for example, I think that youth don't really know unless we help support them to see, well, of course, now there's social media, but to make sure that they engage with other tribal youth and do things like unity but we have a whole program at YDSP with the different agencies that are involved. And they this started, back when we started nation building. So there's a whole kind of summer program where youth are engaged in tribal employment, and they're have mentors to help support them. And they also do like a financial literacy. They're encouraged to join the youth council. They do just different like health programs and things like that. They have a summer program as well. But I think that just them being to learn from different agencies as far as what it takes to run a tribal government, and how whatever they choose to do as adults and how they build their capacity to be able to come back and become leaders, right, is just really one of the best ways to engage them, I think. And then, also, of course, with things such as making sure that they learn different aspects of culture and participate in tribal ceremonies and those, so they can become a full rounded, Pueblo person that contributes to community.
Well, I love that. I think that was the perfect way to end our session, talking about the youth, talking about sort of investing in, because these are the seeds that are going to have to be nurtured over the years, right? They're going to have to come to fruition a little bit later as they get older, as they have experienced life a little bit more. And when they come to then work for their nation or come to work in service of Indian country, they've got sort of a strong scaffolding supporting them in their decisions and their decision making. Well, thank you so much, Chairwoman, for your time, Pat, for your time, Joan, you guys and your firsthand experiences, all of your knowledge. I think you've given us some really practical information and really helpful guidance as folks look at strategic decision making and implementation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So we'll turn gears a little bit. At the end of our sessions, we like to get an update on ARPA, as things are changing. it's good to hear from our good friends, Jennifer Weddle and Del Lavador, about what's going on right now. A quick introduction, Jen is a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation and co-chair of the American Indian Law Practice Group at Greenberg Traurig Law Firm. Del Lavador is a citizen of the Crow Nation, an attorney and former Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs at the Department of Interior. Jen, we'll start with you. The information about ARPA is being updated daily. Can you provide an overview of where we are now and how tribes can stay up to date?
Absolutely, Amy, and thanks to all of our wonderful tribal leaders for sharing so much great information today. It's lovely to be with you. And I'll ask Del to unmute as well and ask Melissa to bring up our slides. The first slide that Melissa will share on the screen is really the shifting deadlines for the Fiscal Recovery Fund second allocation. Treasury has extended that now another time so that employment verification must be made on their portal by Friday, July 16 at 11:59 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. If you do not submit your employment numbers by that deadline, then you're not going to be eligible for the second allocation. It's important to remember that this is just a verification of the employment information your tribe submitted under the CARES Act in April 2020. That's your 2019 employment information for all tribal employees and employees of any entity in which the tribe owns at least a 51% interest. Any supporting documentation that you would have submitted in April of 2020 will automatically populate in the Treasury portal when you go to confirm your information this time around. Or if your tribe didn't enter employment information in April 2020, you also have an opportunity to do that. You have another week and a few days to do it, but as of late last week, Treasury had indicated that 128 tribes had already submitted their employment information. Also last week, Treasury circulated a new Dear Tribal Leader letter on June 30th, indicating that they had received a lot of feedback from tribes and therefore were establishing a $1 million per tribe minimum for that $6.65 billion employment allocation. And then they explained on a Zoom webinar that they had for tribal leaders shortly thereafter that despite a number of requests to do so, that they had considered it and would not be imposing a per tribe maximum. That's still, as with all things at Treasury, something of a moving target, as we've talked about on past webinars. They are responding to more than 1,000. In fact, I believe it's over 5,000 governments to which they're providing fiscal recovery fund guidance, the states, the localities, and tribes. So they're trying to get a lot of very different guidance out simultaneously and trying to make that consistent. I think we're going to continue to see some evolution in Treasury's guidance going forward, and certainly tribes are continuing to weigh in. Next Thursday, July 15th, is the deadline for tribal comments on the interim final rule that Treasury had published. And they also announced that they're going to do a consultation on the interim final rule on August 3rd. We'll post more information about how to register for that session on the website. We're also continuing to track the new FAQs. Only one new set has been published since our last session, and that was new FAQ 2.21. Which really relates to the eligibility of the FRF monies to address housing instability or housing crisis. All this is moving toward the second allocation not coming out until August. Treasury has indicated multiple times that they need all the employment information to be in to know what the full scope of the national pie is going to be before they allocate it. They haven't specified early, mid, or late August. Their FAQs simply say August. So that's the update on what's happening with Treasury. Del and I also thought it would be helpful to share with all of you some of the sources for individual relief that are available to tribal members. This is a lot of technical information, but things that may be really helpful to you as the community keeps coming in to all of your governments and looking for resources. I'm going to go through a few, and then Del will take a few of the housing specific programs at the end of these quick slides. And again, know this is a lot of information. It will be posted on the website. One of the biggest resources for individuals is the child tax credit established in ARPA. The IRS is going to start driving this money out right away. Every family making under $150,000 or single parent making less than $112,000 is going to get a per child tax credit of $3,000 for every child between the ages of 6 and 17, and a tax credit of $3,600 for every child under the age of 6. President Biden is making a very strong push to enlist tribes as partners in this effort, saying that this is going to be the most transformative program to address child poverty ever. This means that as long as you filed 2019 or 2020 taxes and you meet these income thresholds, you will start receiving automatically into your bank account $250 each month per child for every child under 6, and $300 each month per child. I'm sorry, for children under 6, since the $250 for children 6 to 17. As long as you get your IRS tax return and you have a bank account associated with your tax return, then you'll get this money via direct deposit without having to do anything. If you haven't filed taxes, and the administration estimates that there are more than 6 million children around the country for whom no one filed a tax return, they're still eligible to get this credit. Likewise, this credit will have no impact on other benefits such as disability benefits or housing assistance. They do have to enroll on what is ultimately an IRS form, and it's only available online. So the administration is strongly encouraging tribes to establish navigators to assist in that effort. The checks will be mailed to anybody who doesn't have a bank account. The resources are here. The biggest resource, which I neglected to put on this slide, is childtaxcredit.gov. If you go to childtaxcredit.gov, you can see many FAQs and other resources, but this is a good way to start getting money into the hands of families right now. Half the money will be paid out in, like I say, these monthly direct per child distributions, and then the other half every filer will receive when they file their 2021 tax returns. Next slide, Melissa. Back one. Many tribes also submitted a verification for the Pandemic Emergency Assistance Fund, $1 billion. Many tribes got somewhere in the range of several $100,000. This is an HHS program. I have the links here for where you can find what your tribe's allocation may have been. And that's money that you can push out now in terms of direct relief, homelessness assistance, emergency food aid, back to school, utility, burial assistance. It's that kind of direct relief that I know many of the tribal leaders on the Zoom are hearing constant requests for. So that's a very good resource for it that you wouldn't have to tap into your fiscal recovery fund monies to use. Next slide, Melissa. There's also the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, $75 a month for eligible low-income households. This is an FCC program. You can also get credit toward one device per household. Lots of information about this. Basically, participation in any range of other government services for low-income natives will get you in the door to get this benefit. Next slide, Melissa. And then the low-income household water assistance program, again, allocations have already been made on that to assist with water and wastewater bills. The allocation list is available online, as well as a nationwide tribal contact list, so you can find out who to go to locally about how your tribal members can access those programs. And then next slide, Melissa, and I'm turning it over to Del.
Actually, this is still yours, Jen, the SSBCI.
Just kidding. Del could do this too. Treasury did release their guidance late last week on the State Small Business Credit Initiative, a program that's been ongoing since the TARP in the Obama administration. Tribes have a critical deadline, a notice of intent to apply that must be submitted by August 16 to Treasury. They're still developing their application program. They just need your notice that you're going to participate by August 16, and then they're going to allocate $40 million of the small business allocation for tribal governments and perhaps additional dollars as well. There's a minimum allocation of $432,000. And really, tribal governments have a lot of flexibility with this program to support eligible small business financing in any manner the tribe chooses. So huge flexibility to help your entrepreneurs. Just file your notice of intent by August 16. And now for real, I'm tossing it to Del with the next slide.
I promise the viewers this will be brief. There's 4 slides left. These 2 slides deal with the ERAP program, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. It actually originated in the Consolidated Appropriations Act from last December of 2020. There was $800 million that was funneled through tribal designated housing entities, so basically your housing authorities. They applied back in February. There was some guidance that was provided through FAQs, and this is all on Treasury's website, home.treasury.gov. And you can find it when you click on governments and then sub-click on Emergency Rental Assistance Program. There's a link there. And this is just 2 slides to summarize it. So the guidance was finalized March 26th. Oh, I'm sorry, could you go back real quick? I just want to define what it is. Eligibility is to households obligated to grant or arrears on a residential dwelling. And so 1 or more persons qualified for unemployment benefits, reduced household income costs, or financial hardship due to COVID, and then can demonstrate risk of homelessness or housing instability. And then it's the threshold is 80% of the area median income. These funds will expire in 15 months, and they should already be, if the housing entity has done this, they should already be in their account. Next slide, please. How to determine for those 2 terms I just said, homelessness or housing instability, and it talks about basically past due bills or notices of eviction or unsafe or unhealthy living conditions. The income level is set for the annual gross income, and it's the HUD parameters. The ERAP funds can be used for electricity, gas, water, sewer, trash, and energy, and it goes back to March 13th of 2020, and there's a 12-month limit. It cannot be duplicative of other federal resources. And then importantly, these funds can be used to tribal members outside of tribal lands, and they also can be provided to non-tribal members living on tribal lands. I'll just go to the next slide, and you guys can look at the other details. Sorry, this is so fast, but these slides will be made available. The separate fund under Treasury is a homeowner assistance fund under ARPA, and that was $500 million that's set aside out of the $10 billion for all governments for tribal designated housing entities. And it deals with mortgage delinquencies, defaults, foreclosures, loss of utilities, energy, displacements, and qualified expenses. And I'm not going to read through this whole list, but just note that there are more than a dozen reasons, a dozen areas that these funds can be used for. Next slide. And the final slide is, so the notice of funds, these aren't out yet, And I just want to note also that there's a tribal consultation set for next Tuesday by Treasury on this fund, but there will be a notice of funds request before September 30th, 2021. And then in the notice of funds, they would get, if they accept it, and it's a form that's on the Treasury website, initial payment of 10% can be submitted. And then you got to put together your plan, which outlines a lot of the things that were discussed earlier in this podcast or this webinar. And then they'll look to see, Treasury will look to see if the plans are based on alignment of community needs, program design, performance goals, et cetera. So all of those needs assessment that were discussed earlier are going to be necessary in order to implement your plan. Each entity must have this financial assistance agreement. And then the income level is much higher for this, which is 150% of the area median income. And priority for Federal Homeowner Association, VA, or USDA is quarterly reporting. And probably most importantly, these funds can be used for the next 5 years. So there's no rush to do this. It's the rental assistance that has a shorter time frame. And so look for next Tuesday for the half, and I think Treasury will announce when they're expecting to start providing more information. And there is frequently asked questions guidance on the website as well. So back to Amy. Amy or Melissa, I guess.
Thank you so much, Del, and thank you, Jen. We really appreciate all the time and effort you guys put into giving us a recap of what's happened over the last 2 weeks. And I also want to say thank you again to Chairwoman Cheryl Andrews Maltese and to Pat Riggs and to Joan Tamici. Thank you for joining us once again. I hope all of you watching today's session found today to be useful. We'll follow up in another 2 weeks with the next session. We'll be focusing on investing in your people with a specific focus on mental and public health planning. We hope you'll join us and that you'll share our invitations to these ARPA informational programs with your network of concerned organizations and people. You can find further information, including a recording of today's program and useful follow-up materials, all the slides, all the URLs at the Harbor Project's website, which is simply hpaied.org. Thank you again, and hope to see you all in 2 weeks.